The Calith Reclamation Fleet had surveyed 11,304 intelligent species before they found one that broke their oldest law. They called it the Doctrine of Proportion, though the earliest records simply named it the Ledger. The rule was simple, and every civilization the Calith had ever catalogued obeyed it without exception. No single life outweighs the resources spent to save it. When the numbers turned against you, you let go. Every species learned this within a few centuries of leaving their homeworld, some in the slow arithmetic of famine, others in the sharp lesson of a battle where reinforcements never came. It was not cruelty. It was simply the shape survival took, and the Calith had watched that shape hold firm across 400,000 years of recorded contact. Then they found humanity. Third archivist Vel had drawn a quiet post for this rotation, a listening station tucked near a modest mining colony called Kestrel Reach, orbiting a gas giant on the ragged edge of charted space. The assignment was meant to be uneventful, a decade of passive observation folded neatly into the endless archive. Vel had already catalogued 17 species this way, recording their birth rates and trade routes and the wars they fought over water or pride, filing each report without much thought. Then, a tunnel collapsed on the third moon of the gas giant, 40 minutes before the end of a mining shift, and Vel watched proportion break. The collapse trapped a single engineer 800 meters beneath the surface, behind 11,000 tons of shifted rock. Her name, according to the colony's public roster, was Elena Reyes. She had 4 hours of breathable air in her suit reserve, a fractured support strut pinning her left leg, and a comm line that carried only static after the first 10 minutes. Vel ran the numbers out of habit, the same calculation performed on every one of the 11,304 worlds before this one. Probability of successful extraction within the air window, 4%. Cost of full rescue mobilization, a drilling barge diverted from 3 weeks of scheduled ore extraction, 2 orbital shuttles burning through reserve fuel meant for the following season, and roughly 140 colonists pulled from paying work to dig, haul, and monitor seismic readings through the night. By every measure Vel had ever recorded, the correct response was silence, a memorial, a name added to a wall. The colony would grieve, log the loss, and return to the business of surviving the next season, because that was what proportion demanded and what every species before this one had, eventually, learned to accept. Kestrel Reach did not consult the ledger. Within 6 minutes of the collapse, the colony's entire mining fleet had been recalled from the outer belt. Within 20, the drilling barge Meridian had reversed its course and burned fuel it did not have budgeted, cutting 3 weeks off its remaining operational life to shave 2 hours off its arrival time. Off-shift workers who had already logged 12 hours underground climbed back into their suits without being asked twice. A cook from the colony's mess hall, who had never operated heavy equipment in her life, spent the night hauling coolant canisters because every pair of hands mattered, and nobody told her to stop. Vel watched the seismic sensors climb into dangerous territory as the rescue teams pushed deeper than any safety protocol allowed, and understood with the detached clarity of a long-trained observer that these people were spending far more than they stood to gain. The math had never once supported this, and still they dug. What struck Vel hardest was not the scale of the effort, but its texture. There was no ceremony to it, no grand address rallying the colony to sacrifice. People simply moved, one after another, as though the decision to try had already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought, long before anyone had time to calculate the odds. A supervisor who had spent the last 2 years in a quiet dispute with Reyes over shift assignments was the first to volunteer for the lead drilling crew. A retired miner, well past the age the colony required for physical labor, appeared at the tunnel mouth with his old gear and refused to be sent home. None of it resembled strategy. It resembled something closer to reflex, as though refusing to abandon one of their own were less a choice than a fact about what they were. The air window closed twice by the colony's own instruments, and twice the rescue teams kept digging anyway, running the math themselves and choosing to disbelieve it. Vel recorded the seismic charts, the fuel consumption, the mounting hours of labor spent chasing a probability that any rational species would have written off before the second hour. By the standard of every prior world, this was not resilience. It was waste. It was the kind of decision that, repeated often enough, hollowed out a civilization from the inside, spending its future on losses it could never recover. And yet the tunnel held, and yet they kept moving. At hour 3, a secondary collapse sealed the main access shaft, cutting off the lead crew's most direct route and forcing them into a narrower service conduit that had not been rated for use in over a decade. The colony's chief engineer made the call to send a team through it anyway, accepting a personal risk that no insurance clause and no safety board would have sanctioned. Vel noted the decision, then noted something stranger still. Nobody hesitated to volunteer for that team either. They reached Reyes with 11 minutes of air remaining in her suit reserve. She was alive, barely conscious, her leg crushed beyond immediate repair, but breathing. The rescue team's own report, filed hours later in the plane, unembellished language typical of Kestrel Reach's records, noted the extraction time, the medical status, and the names of everyone who had taken part, more than 130 in total, listed without rank or distinction between the engineer who designed the final drilling angle and the cook who had spent the night hauling canisters. Vel filed the incident as required, transmitting the full data set back through the relay chain toward Calith Central Archive. Resource cost, survival probability, final outcome, standard categories built to measure 400,000 years of consistent behavior across every species that had ever left its homeworld. For the first time in Vel's service, the categories did not fit. There was no efficient way to describe what had happened beneath that moon, no clean variable for the fact that the colony had spent nearly a season's worth of fuel and labor for a 4% chance, and had done so not as a calculated gamble, but as something closer to an article of faith none of them had needed to discuss aloud. The report reached Calith Central Archive 14 days later. Word came back that senior archivists wished the incident logged as an anomaly, an outlier unlikely to reflect broader human behavior, easily filed alongside the rare statistical flukes every species produced now and then. Vel was asked to confirm the classification and close the file. Vel requested 3 more years on post instead. What followed were not further anomalies, but a pattern, quiet and consistent, repeating itself in forms too varied to dismiss. A fishing trawler diverted 200 kilometers off course to search for a single missing crew member long after any reasonable hope should have expired. A hospital ship holding position under hostile fire to complete an evacuation of 12 patients when retreat would have cost nothing but those 12 lives. A search team on a frozen continent walking through a storm that had already claimed one of their own, refusing to turn back until every name on their list was accounted for, alive or otherwise. None of these decisions made sense within the ledger. All of them were, to the humans who made them, simply what the moment required. Vel began to suspect that the old law had never described a truth about survival at all. It had only described the limit of what most species were willing to spend on each other, and humanity, for reasons the archive had no clean category to hold, had simply never learned where that limit was supposed to be. The final report Vel filed carried no recommendation, only a single observation appended to the data, unusual for an archivist trained to remain outside the record. It noted that the doctrine of proportion had held across 11,304 species, not because it was a law of survival, but because it was a law of limits, and that every species before this one had simply agreed in the end to have them. Kestrel Reach never learned that anyone had been watching, and would likely have found the fact unremarkable if they had. They had already returned to their ordinary business within days of the rescue, repairing the tunnel, restocking the barge, filing Elena Reyes's recovery under routine medical updates. To them, there had been nothing extraordinary in what they had done. There had only been one of their own, still breathing somewhere in the dark, and a debt that every hand in the colony had felt obligated to pay before the air ran out. Somewhere past the edge of charted space, an archive built across 400,000 years quietly began revising a law it had never once needed to question before.